Dr. Robert Sterling's scalpel froze mid-incision, his gloved hands trembling as something metallic glinted beneath Harold Thompson's inflamed tissue. The expected fatty tumor wasn't there. Instead, a corroded bullet fragment lay embedded in a nest of chronically infected flesh that had festered for decades. The surgical nurse behind him gasped audibly, her instrument tray clattering to the floor as she stumbled backward. The anesthesiologist's monitor began beeping frantically, reflecting the team's collective shock rather than the patient's stable vitals. Even the stoic OR technician, who had witnessed 30 years of medical surprises, stood slack-jawed at the discovery. In the hallway outside, Harold's son, David, paced nervously, clutching a coffee cup and checking his watch for the fourth time in 10 minutes, completely unaware that his father had carried this deadly secret for 40 years. The man who raised him, to be honest, who preached that a man's word is his bond, had been living with the ultimate lie. "Get pathology down here immediately," Dr. Sterling commanded, his voice betraying none of the turmoil racing through his mind. What else had Harold Thompson been hiding? And how had this fragment nearly killed him twice? Once when it entered, and now as it threatened to destroy everything his family believed about their patriarch. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 weeks earlier, the morning mist hung heavy over the Thompson family farm in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where Harold Hank Thompson had lived for 68 years. The sprawling 40-acre property, with its weathered red barn and white farmhouse built in 1952, stood as a testament to 3 generations of hard work and Midwestern values. Cornfields stretched endlessly toward the horizon, their golden stalks ready for harvest, while the old John Deere tractor sat silent in the yard, much like Hank himself these days. Hank had always been a man of few words, but the silence had grown deeper since Helen's passing 2 years ago. The farmhouse, once filled with the laughter of 3 children and the warm aroma of Helen's apple pies, now echoed with the loneliness of a widower who refused to admit he needed help. Framed photographs lined the mantelpiece. David in his high school football uniform, Lisa on her wedding day, Michael graduating from trade school, and countless pictures of grandchildren whose visits had become increasingly rare. At 68, Hank carried himself with the rigid posture of a man shaped by military discipline and decades of factory work at John Deere. His weathered hands, scarred from barbed wire and machinery, still gripped his morning coffee cup with steady determination. "A man's word is his bond," he would tell anyone who'd listen, a phrase his own father, Earl, had drilled into him. Yet beneath that stoic exterior, Hank harbored secrets that would have shattered the very foundation of everything his family believed about honor and truth. David Thompson, 45 and struggling through a messy divorce, lived 30 minutes away in Cedar Rapids, where he worked as an insurance adjuster. The irony wasn't lost on him, spending his days calculating other people's risks while ignoring the growing distance between himself and his father. Guilt gnawed at him constantly. He knew his mother would have expected him to check on Hank more often, but work demands and his own emotional struggles kept him away from the farm where he'd grown up. Sarah Mitchell, the 38-year-old registered nurse who lived in the neighboring farmhouse, had become Hank's unofficial guardian angel. A single mother raising 12-year-old Tommy, she understood the weight of carrying responsibilities alone. Her own father had died when she was young, making her particularly sensitive to Hank's solitary existence. She often brought him casseroles and helped with minor repairs, accepting his gruff gratitude with the patience of someone who recognized pain beneath pride. Martha "Marty" Henderson, Helen's 72-year-old best friend, served as the unofficial keeper of Hank's well-being. A retired nurse with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, Marty had been stopping by daily since Helen's funeral, bringing meals and unwanted medical advice, What others didn't know was that Marty harbored feelings for Hank that went far deeper than neighborly concern, feelings she'd buried for 30 years out of respect for Helen's marriage. As autumn settled over Iowa, none of them could have imagined that a simple lump on Hank's back would soon unravel 40 years of carefully guarded secrets. September 15th dawned crisp and clear, the kind of morning that made Hank Thompson grateful to be alive despite the persistent ache in his joints. At 5:30 sharp, he stood under the shower's lukewarm spray, methodically washing away another night's restless sleep. The farmhouse's old plumbing groaned in protest, a sound as familiar as his own heartbeat after decades of morning routines that Helen used to tease him about. As he reached for the soap, his fingers brushed against something unusual between his shoulder blades, a small, firm bump that hadn't been there before. Hank twisted awkwardly, trying to get a better feel for the growth, but the angle made it impossible to examine properly. Probably just a cyst, he muttered to himself, remembering old Doc Peterson, who used to get similar growths removed every few years. No point making a mountain out of a molehill. The bump was roughly the size of a grape, not particularly painful, just there. Hank had survived 68 years by not dwelling on every minor ailment, and he wasn't about to start now. Helen used to scold him for his stubborn streak when it came to medical matters, but she wasn't here anymore to drag him to doctor's appointments for every little thing. Over the following days, Hank found himself unconsciously favoring his left side when lifting hay bales or reaching for tools in the barn. The bump seemed to be growing, but he pushed the thought away with the same determination that had carried him through military service and 40 years on the factory floor. Mind over matter, he told himself, though the nagging sensation made it increasingly difficult to ignore. By September 22nd, the growth had doubled in size, roughly the size of a golf ball now, and sleeping on his back had become uncomfortable. Hank found himself tossing and turning through the night, eventually settling into an awkward position on his side that left him stiff and irritable by morning. When Marty stopped by with her weekly offering of pot roast and unsolicited health advice, she noticed him wincing as he lifted the casserole dish. "Hank Thompson, what's wrong with your shoulder?" she demanded, her nurse's instincts immediately suspicious of his careful movements. "Nothing that won't work itself out," he replied gruffly, avoiding her penetrating stare. "Just pulled something moving those feed sacks yesterday." Marty's expression clearly indicated she wasn't buying his explanation, but Hank had perfected the art of deflecting concern over the years. He quickly changed the subject to the weather forecast and his plans for harvesting the back 40 acres, effectively shutting down any further medical inquiries. By September 29th, the bump had grown to the size of a tennis ball, and the constant aching had begun affecting his appetite and mood. Hank caught himself snapping at Tommy Mitchell when the boy offered to help stack firewood, immediately regretting his harsh tone when he saw the hurt in the 12-year-old's eyes. "Sorry, son," he mumbled, but the damage was done. That evening, alone in his bedroom, Hank stared at Helen's photograph on the nightstand. "Honey, I don't know what this thing is, but I'm starting to get worried," he whispered to the smiling face that had shared his pillow for 43 years. "You always said I was too stubborn for my own good." The silence that answered him felt heavier than usual, and for the first time since discovering the growth, genuine fear crept into his thoughts. October 6th marked 3 weeks since he'd first noticed the bump, and it had grown to an alarming size. The constant pressure against his shirt collar made him increasingly irritable, and the pain had progressed from a dull ache to sharp, shooting sensations that took his breath away. When David called to discuss plans for his upcoming birthday visit, Hank found himself cutting the conversation short, unable to concentrate through the discomfort. "Dad, you sound tired," David had said, concern evident in his voice. "Are you feeling okay?" "Just getting old, son," Hank replied, hating himself for the lie but unable to voice his growing fears. Nothing a good night's sleep won't cure. But sleep had become increasingly elusive. Hank would lie awake staring at the ceiling, his mind wandering to dark possibilities he refused to acknowledge during daylight hours. Cancer. The word hung unspoken in the darkness, a specter that had claimed too many of his friends from the VFW over the years. Helen had died from heart failure, quick and merciful compared to the prolonged suffering he'd witnessed in others. By October 8th, when David arrived for his birthday visit carrying a store-bought cake and wearing a forced smile, the growth had become impossible to hide. Hank's careful movements and obvious discomfort couldn't escape his son's notice, setting in motion a chain of events that would forever change their understanding of the quiet man who had raised them to value honesty above all else. David Thompson arrived at the farmhouse on October 8th carrying a chocolate birthday cake from the grocery store and wearing the kind of forced smile that masked deeper concerns. At 45, he had developed an eye for reading people's pain, a skill honed through years of investigating insurance claims and dealing with his own recent divorce proceedings. The moment his father embraced him at the front door, David felt the telltale stiffness in Hank's movements and the way he favored his left side. "Happy birthday, Dad," David said, trying to keep his voice light despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. 68 years young and still going strong. Hank's smile was genuine but strained, and when he reached for the cake box, a barely suppressed wince crossed his weathered features. "Thanks, son. Your mother always said store-bought was just as good, though we both know she was lying through her teeth." The attempt at humor fell flat as another wave of discomfort caused him to shift his weight awkwardly. They spent the afternoon on the front porch, sharing coffee and watching the golden corn sway in the autumn breeze. David noticed how his father kept adjusting his position in the old wooden rocking chair, never quite finding comfort. When Hank excused himself to use the bathroom, David heard him suppressing a groan as he stood up, and that's when he decided to call for reinforcements. Marty Henderson arrived within minutes of David's phone call, her silver hair pulled back in its usual no-nonsense bun and her blue eyes sharp with concern. She had known the Thompson family for over 30 years, and her nursing background made her particularly attuned to signs of distress that others might miss. "Hank Thompson, I've been watching you favor that left shoulder for weeks now," she announced without preamble, marching up the porch steps with the confidence of someone who had spent decades dealing with stubborn patients. "Don't try to tell me it's nothing because I wasn't born yesterday." "Marty, I appreciate the concern, but I'm fine," Hank protested, though his defensive posture suggested otherwise. "Just a little stiffness from all the farm work, nothing that won't work itself out given time." David exchanged a meaningful look with Marty before standing up and crossing his arms. "Dad, I've been here for 3 hours, and you haven't sat still for more than 5 minutes. That's not normal, and you know it." The conversation might have continued in circles if Sarah Mitchell hadn't chosen that moment to return from her shift at Cedar Falls Regional Medical Center. Still wearing her blue scrubs and looking exhausted from a 12-hour day, she noticed the tense tableau on the porch and immediately understood the situation. "Mr. Thompson," she said gently, setting down her nursing bag and approaching with the calm professionalism that had made her invaluable in the hospital's emergency department. "David called me over because we're all worried about you. Would you mind if I took a quick look at whatever's bothering you?" Hank's resistance crumbled in the face of Sarah's gentle but authoritative tone. She had been like a daughter to him since moving next door 15 years ago, and her medical expertise carried weight that even his stubborn pride couldn't dismiss. With obvious reluctance, he allowed her to guide him inside to the living room, where the better lighting would allow for a proper examination. "I need you to remove your shirt, sir," Sarah said, pulling on latex gloves from her bag. "I promise this won't take long." The mass between Hank's shoulder blades was immediately visible the moment his shirt came off, a grotesque bulge roughly the size of a tennis ball that had distorted the normal contours of his back. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible. and David felt his knees go weak at the sight of what his father had been hiding. "Dear God, Dad," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "How long has this been growing?" "About 3 weeks," Hank admitted, his voice barely above a murmur. "Maybe a little longer." Sarah's professional training kicked in as she gently palpated the mass, noting its firm consistency and the heat radiating from the surrounding tissue. "Mr. Thompson, this needs immediate medical attention. I'm talking about seeing a doctor tomorrow morning, not next week, or when you get around to it." "Now, hold on a minute," Hank protested, but his objection lacked conviction. "I can't afford to go running to doctors every time something feels a little off. Do you know what they charge for office visits these days?" Marty stepped forward, her nurse's intuition telling her this was far more serious than a simple cyst or lipoma. "Hank, I've seen enough lumps and bumps in my 40 years of nursing to know when something requires professional attention. This isn't about money. This is about your life." David pulled out his phone, his hands shaking slightly as he searched for local physicians. "Dad, I'll figure out the financial part later. Right now, we need to get you to someone who can tell us what we're dealing with." The weight of their combined concern finally broke through Hank's defenses. He had spent 2 years since Helen's death trying to prove he could manage on his own, but the fear in his son's eyes and the professional alarm in Sarah's expression forced him to confront the reality he had been avoiding. "All right," he said quietly, sinking into his recliner with obvious relief at no longer having to carry the burden alone. "I'll call Dr. Sterling's office first thing in the morning." Sarah was already reaching for her phone. "I'll call tonight and explain the situation. Dr. Sterling owes me a favor from last month when I covered extra shifts in the OR. He'll see you tomorrow." As the sun set over the cornfields that had defined Hank's entire life, none of them could have imagined that this moment of reluctant surrender would be the first step toward uncovering a family secret that had festered as long as the mysterious growth on his back. The morning of October 15th arrived gray and drizzling, matching Hank's mood as David helped him into the passenger seat of the pickup truck for the drive to Cedar Falls Regional Medical Center. The familiar rumble of the engine did little to calm his nerves, and he found himself gripping the door handle tighter than necessary as they navigated the winding country roads toward town. Dr. Robert Sterling's office occupied the second floor of the medical center's main building, its sterile walls lined with diplomas and certificates that spoke to decades of surgical experience. At 52, Dr. Sterling had built a reputation as one of Iowa's most skilled general surgeons, but more importantly to Hank, he was known for his respectful treatment of veteran patients. The doctor's own father had served in Vietnam, giving him an understanding of military culture that put former servicemen at ease. "Mr. Thompson, Doctor," Sterling said, extending a firm handshake as he entered the examination room. "Sarah Mitchell spoke very highly of you when she called last night. She's concerned about a growth you've been dealing with." Hank appreciated the doctor's straightforward manner as he explained the timeline of the mass's development. Dr. Sterling listened intently, occasionally nodding as he made notes on his tablet. When it came time for the physical examination, Hank steeled himself for the inevitable shock he had grown accustomed to seeing on people's faces. "This is quite substantial," Dr. Sterling murmured, his experienced hands carefully palpating the area around the growth. "The consistency suggests it could be a lipoma, a benign fatty tumor, but the rapid growth rate and location are somewhat unusual. I'd like to get some imaging done to better understand what we're dealing with." The mention of imaging studies immediately triggered Hank's anxiety about medical costs. "Doctor, I need to be upfront about my financial situation. I'm on a fixed income and my Medicare coverage has some significant gaps when it comes to specialized procedures." Dr. Sterling paused his examination, meeting Hank's eyes with a compassionate expression that reminded the older man of his own son. "Mr. Thompson, let's focus on getting the right diagnosis first. We'll figure out the financial aspects as we go. And I want you to know that this practice has programs to help veterans who are facing economic hardships. The initial CT scan was scheduled for later that afternoon, requiring Hank to drink a contrast solution that tasted like chalk mixed with artificial cherry flavoring. As he lay on the scanning table, listening to the machine's rhythmic humming, he found his thoughts drifting to Helen and how she would have handled this situation. She would have been asking the technicians detailed questions about the procedure, probably making them laugh with her gentle humor while ensuring every detail was explained clearly. 3 days later, on October 18th, the results arrived with news that only deepened the mystery. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the staff radiologist, had noted several concerning features in her report. The mass appeared to have a dense, metallic core surrounded by inflamed tissue, and the surrounding area showed signs of chronic infection that could have been present for years. The imaging shows something we don't typically see in standard lipomas, Dr. Sterling explained during the follow-up appointment, pulling up the CT images on his computer screen. There's a metallic density at the center that could be calcification, but it's unusually well defined. We need to remove this surgically to determine exactly what we're dealing with. David, who had insisted on attending every appointment, leaned forward in his chair. What are you thinking it might be, Doctor? You can be straight with us. We're not the type to fall apart at bad news. Dr. Sterling appreciated their direct approach, but chose his words carefully. Until we can examine the tissue directly, I don't want to speculate too much. What I can tell you is that the chronic inflammation suggests this has been developing for much longer than the 3 weeks since you first noticed it, Mr. Thompson. Sometimes masses can grow internally for months or even years before becoming visible externally. The financial reality of surgery hit the family like a physical blow when the hospital's billing department provided their estimate. The procedure itself would cost approximately $35,000, with potential additional costs if complications arose or if specialized testing was required. Hank's Medicare coverage would pay for roughly 60%, leaving a balance that represented more money than he had seen in one place since selling his small piece of farmland 5 years earlier. I can't do this to my family, Hank told David privately as they sat in the hospital cafeteria afterward. You're already stretched thin with your divorce expenses, and I won't have you going into debt for something that might not even be serious. David's response was immediate and fierce. Dad, you spent 40 years making sure our family was taken care of. You worked double shifts at John Deere to pay for our college educations. You never took a vacation that wasn't camping in a state park, and you drove cars with 200,000 miles on them so we could have what we needed. It's our turn to take care of you. But the financial strain was real and undeniable. David's recent divorce had drained most of his savings, and his siblings, while willing to help, had their own families and mortgages to consider. The burden of the decision weighed heavily on all of them, particularly Hank, who had always prided himself on being self-sufficient. The solution came from an unexpected source. Marty Henderson had been quietly making phone calls to members of the local VFW post, the church congregation, and longtime neighbors who remembered Hank's years of community service. Within 48 hours, she had organized a grassroots fundraising campaign that began with a bake sale at the church and quickly expanded to include a fish fry at the VFW hall and an auction of donated items from local businesses. I can't accept charity, Hank protested when Marty presented him with the initial proceeds, nearly $3,000 raised in just 2 days. I've never taken a handout in my life, and I'm not about to start now. Marty's response was delivered with the sharp tongue that had made her legendary among her former patients. Hank Thompson, this isn't charity. This is community. You've helped half the people in this town at one time or another. You fixed Charlie Morrison's tractor engine for free when his farm was struggling. You spent 3 weekends helping rebuild the church roof after that storm damage. You've shoveled more driveways and delivered more groceries to shut-ins than anyone else in Cedar Falls. Now it's time to let people return the favor." Sarah Mitchell contributed in her own way, using her connections at the hospital to ensure that Hank would receive the best possible care at the most reasonable cost. She spoke with Dr. Sterling about payment plans and researched charitable programs that might help cover the remaining expenses. Her professional reputation and personal advocacy carried significant weight within the medical center's administration. The community response was overwhelming. The local newspaper ran a feature story about Hank's situation, highlighting his 40 years of employment at John Deere and his decades of volunteer work with the VFW. Donations began arriving from people Hank barely knew, former co-workers, fellow veterans, and neighbors who had benefited from his quiet generosity over the years. "This is what small-town America is supposed to be about," wrote the newspaper's editorial board. "When one of our own faces a crisis, we come together to help. Harold Thompson represents the best of what it means to be a neighbor and a community member." By October 22nd, the fundraising efforts had generated enough money to cover Hank's portion of the surgical costs, with additional funds continuing to arrive daily. The outpouring of support overwhelmed him emotionally, forcing him to confront the reality that his years of quiet service had not gone unnoticed by his community. The surgery was scheduled for October 25th, giving Hank 3 days to prepare both practically and emotionally. Sarah helped him complete the necessary preoperative paperwork and explained each step of the process in terms he could understand. Dr. Sterling's team would perform the procedure early in the morning with the expectation that Hank would be able to return home the same day if no complications arose. During these final days of preparation, Hank found himself reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. The discovery of the mass had forced him to acknowledge his mortality in ways he had been avoiding since Helen's death. More surprisingly, it had also revealed the depth of connection he maintained with his community, despite his tendency toward isolation in recent years. On the evening of October 24th, as he sat in his recliner watching the local news and trying to calm his pre-surgical anxiety, Hank was struck by a profound sense of gratitude mixed with apprehension. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions he had been afraid to ask. But tonight he was surrounded by the knowledge that he was not facing this challenge alone. The irony was not lost on him that a mysterious growth on his back had somehow brought his family and community closer together than they had been in years. Whatever tomorrow's surgery revealed, the experience had already taught him valuable lessons about accepting help and recognizing the importance of human connection in times of crisis. October 25th dawned cold and clear, with frost covering the cornfields like a crystalline blanket that reminded Hank of the mornings he used to hunt with his father decades ago. He had been awake since 4:30, unable to sleep despite the sedative Dr. Sterling had prescribed. The pre-operative instructions prohibited eating or drinking anything after midnight, leaving his mouth dry and his stomach churning with nervous energy as he sat in his kitchen, staring at the coffee maker he couldn't use. David arrived at 5:15, carrying 2 travel mugs of coffee for himself and looking almost as anxious as his father felt. "How are you holding up, Dad?" he asked, though Hank's pale complexion and the dark circles under his eyes provided the answer. "Been better," Hank admitted, his voice hoarse from the sleepless night. "Keep thinking about your mother and how she used to say that worrying about tomorrow steals the peace from today. Wish I could take her advice right about now." Marty Henderson knocked softly on the front door at 5:30, entering without waiting for permission in the way that only longtime family friends could manage. She carried a small overnight bag and wore the determined expression of someone prepared for battle. "I'm riding with you to the hospital," she announced, brooking no argument. "Sarah's meeting us there before her shift starts, and between the 3 of us, We'll make sure you're properly looked after." The drive to Cedar Falls Regional Medical Center passed in relative silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts as the countryside gradually gave way to the suburban outskirts of town. Hank found himself studying the familiar landmarks, the old grain elevator, the Lutheran church where he and Helen had been married, the elementary school where his children had learned to read, as if seeing them for the last time. At the hospital, Sarah Mitchell was waiting in the surgical admissions area, having arranged her schedule to be present during Hank's procedure. She had traded shifts with a colleague and would be assisting Dr. Sterling's team in the operating room, an arrangement that provided immeasurable comfort to both Hank and his family. "Mr. Thompson," she said warmly, embracing him gently to avoid aggravating the mass on his back. "Dr. Sterling is already here, and the OR team is preparing everything. We're going to take excellent care of you today." The preoperative process moved with efficient precision. Hank changed into a hospital gown that tied in the back, the thin fabric making him feel vulnerable and exposed. A cheerful nurse named Patricia started his IV line, chatting about the beautiful autumn weather while expertly finding a vein in his weathered hand. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, explained the procedure for putting him under general anesthesia, her calm professionalism helping to ease some of his anxiety. Dr. Sterling arrived at 7:15, reviewing Hank's chart one final time before the surgery. "How are you feeling this morning, Mr. Thompson?" he asked, his steady presence immediately inspiring confidence. "Nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs," Hank replied, using one of his father's old expressions, "but ready to get this over with and find out what we're dealing with." "That's exactly the right attitude," Dr. Sterling assured him. "Based on the imaging, I expect this to be a straightforward procedure. We'll make a small incision, remove the mass completely, and send it to pathology for analysis. You should be awake and talking within a couple of hours." At 7:30, the transport team arrived to wheel Hank to the operating room. David squeezed his father's hand, fighting back tears as he watched the gurney disappear through the surgical suite doors. "I love you, Dad," he called out, receiving a thumbs-up gesture in response. The operating room was a marvel of modern medical technology, with bright lights, monitors, and gleaming surgical instruments arranged with military precision. As the anesthesia took hold, Hank's last conscious thought was of Helen's gentle smile and her voice telling him that everything would be all right. Dr. Sterling made the initial incision at 8:15, expecting to encounter the typical yellowish tissue of a fatty tumor. Instead, his scalpel revealed inflamed, reddish tissue that had clearly been infected for an extended period. The mass itself was firm and irregular, nothing like the smooth, encapsulated lipomas he routinely removed. "This doesn't look like what we expected," he murmured to Sarah, who was assisting with suction and retraction. "The tissue appears chronically inflamed, almost like there's been a foreign body reaction." As Dr. Sterling carefully dissected deeper into the mass, his instruments encountered something hard and metallic. The unexpected resistance caused him to pause, exchanging concerned glances with his surgical team. "Sarah, can you increase the suction here? I need to see what we're dealing with." The moment of discovery came at 8:42, when Dr. Sterling's forceps finally grasped the foreign object and began to extract it from its nest of infected tissue. What emerged was a corroded, irregularly shaped piece of metal approximately the size of a marble, darkened by decades of oxidation and biological reaction. "That's a bullet fragment," Sarah whispered, her professional composure momentarily shaken by the revelation. "But Mr. Thompson was never wounded in combat. His military service was during peacetime." Dr. Sterling held the fragment up to the light, noting its distinctive shape and the way the surrounding tissue had formed a protective capsule around it. "This has been here for decades," he observed, his mind racing through the medical implications. The body's been fighting a chronic infection around this foreign object for years, maybe even decades. The surgical team worked in stunned silence as Dr. Sterling carefully removed all of the infected tissue surrounding the bullet fragment, ensuring that no trace of the chronic infection remained. The cavity left behind was substantial, requiring careful irrigation and drainage to prevent post-operative complications. "We need to notify pathology immediately," Dr. Sterling instructed the circulating nurse. "I want this fragment analyzed, and I want cultures taken from all of this infected tissue. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with here." The surgery, originally scheduled for 1 hour, extended to nearly 4 hours as Dr. Sterling meticulously cleaned the infected area and removed all traces of the foreign body reaction. The bullet fragment had created a complex web of scar tissue and chronic inflammation that required careful dissection to avoid damaging surrounding healthy tissue. In the family waiting room, David paced nervously as the hours stretched by without word from the surgical team. Marty sat quietly in a corner chair, her fingers working through the rosary beads she had carried for 40 years of nursing crises. Other family members had arrived, Lisa driving down from Des Moines with her husband, Michael, taking time off from his construction job to be present for their father. "What's taking so long?" Lisa asked for the 3rd time, her voice tight with anxiety. "Doctor." Sterling said it would be a simple procedure. "Sometimes these things are more complicated than they appear," Marty replied, though her own nursing experience told her that a 4-hour surgery for mass removal was highly unusual. "We just have to trust that Dr. Sterling knows what he's doing." At 12:30, Dr. Sterling finally emerged from the surgical suite, still wearing his scrubs and looking emotionally drained despite the successful completion of the procedure. The family immediately gathered around him, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and fear as they waited for his report. "The surgery went well, and your father is stable," he began, providing the reassurance they needed most. "However, what we found was quite unexpected. Instead of a benign tumor, we discovered a bullet fragment that had been embedded in Mr. Thompson's back for what appears to be several decades." The silence that followed was deafening. David felt his knees go weak as the implications of the doctor's words sank in. A bullet fragment, but Dad was never shot. He served during peacetime, never saw combat. Dr. Sterling nodded sympathetically. "I understand this is shocking news. The fragment will be analyzed by our pathology department, and we'll have more information about its composition and approximate age within a few days. What I can tell you is that your father's body has been fighting a chronic infection around this foreign object for many years, which explains the recent rapid growth and inflammation." As the family struggled to process this revelation, one question dominated their thoughts. If Hank Thompson had never been wounded in military service, how had a bullet fragment remained hidden in his back for decades? And more troubling still, why had he never mentioned being shot? The recovery room felt like a tomb of secrets as Hank Thompson slowly emerged from the fog of anesthesia. His family gathered around his bedside with questions burning in their eyes. The bullet fragment sat in a sterile container on the nearby medical cart, a small piece of corroded metal that had just shattered 40 years of carefully constructed family history. David clutched his father's hand, feeling the familiar calluses from decades of farm work while struggling to reconcile the man he thought he knew with this devastating revelation. "Dad," David whispered, as Hank's eyes finally focused with recognition, "we need to talk about what the doctors found in your back." Hank's face went ashen, even paler than the hospital sheets. His lips moved soundlessly for a moment before he managed to croak out, "What? What did they tell you?" "They found a bullet fragment," Lisa said, her voice barely controlled. "A bullet fragment that's been in your back for decades. Dad, you told us you were never wounded. You said your military service was peaceful, that you never saw combat. The machines monitoring Hank's vital signs began beeping more rapidly as his heart rate spiked. Panic filled his eyes. Not the confusion of someone falsely accused, but the terror of someone whose deepest secret had been exposed. I can't. This isn't," he stammered, his weathered hands trembling against the blanket. Marty stepped forward, her nursing instincts taking over despite her own emotional turmoil. "Hank, you need to calm down. Your blood pressure is spiking, and that's not good for your recovery." But even as she spoke the professional words, her voice carried the weight of personal betrayal. This was the man she had loved in silence for 30 years, the man she thought she knew better than anyone. Dr. Sterling returned with the preliminary pathology report, his expression grave as he addressed the family. "The fragment appears to be from a .22 caliber bullet, and based on the corrosion patterns and tissue response, it's been embedded for approximately 40 to 50 years. This wasn't a recent wound. It dates back to Mr. Thompson's young adulthood." "That's impossible," Michael said, his voice rising with anger. "Dad would have told us if he'd been shot. He raised us to be honest, to never lie to family. A man's word is his bond. That's what you always said, isn't it, Dad?" Hank closed his eyes, tears seeping from beneath his lids as the weight of decades of deception crashed down upon him. "You don't understand," he whispered. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. Nobody was supposed to get hurt." "Then tell us what really happened," David demanded, his voice breaking with emotion. 40 years, Dad. 40 years of lies. Mom went to her grave not knowing the truth, didn't she?" The accusation hit Hank like a physical blow. Helen had known, God help him, she had known everything, had helped him carry the secret all these years. But he couldn't tell them that, couldn't taint their memories of their mother with the knowledge that she, too, had been part of the deception. Sarah Mitchell, who had been standing quietly in the corner still wearing her surgical scrubs, finally spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, whatever happened, we're your family. We love you. But we can't help you if you won't tell us the truth." Hank's breathing became labored, and the heart monitor's alarms grew more insistent. Dr. Sterling immediately checked his pulse and blood pressure, frowning at the readings. "I need everyone to step out for a few minutes. Mr. Thompson needs to rest, and his stress levels are dangerously elevated." "We're not leaving," David said firmly. "Not until he tells us what really happened." "You'll leave now, or I'll have security escort you out," Dr. Sterling replied with quiet authority. "Your father just underwent major surgery, and this level of stress could cause serious complications. The conversation can wait until he's stronger." Reluctantly, the family filed out into the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the sterile corridor like gunshots. Lisa collapsed into a waiting room chair, sobbing openly for the first time since arriving at the hospital. How could he lie to us for so long? About something so important? Michael paced the floor, his construction worker's hands clenched into fists. All those times he lectured us about honesty, about being men of integrity. What kind of hypocrite have we been living with? Marty sat in stunned silence, replaying decades of conversations and interactions, searching for clues she might have missed. The man she had fallen in love with, the man she had watched grieve for Helen with such apparent devotion, had been carrying a secret that called everything into question. Had their entire relationship been built on lies? Meanwhile, back in the recovery room, Hank lay staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through the events of 1975 that had set this nightmare in motion. The hunting trip with his father, Earl, the misty morning that had changed everything, the split-second decision that had protected one secret while creating another. The young man he had been, trying to save his father's reputation, could never have imagined the long-term consequences of that choice. His thoughts turned to Helen, and for the first time since her death, He was grateful she wasn't alive to see this moment. She had begged him over the years to tell the children the truth, had argued that secrets had a way of destroying families from within. "The truth will set you free," she used to say, "but first it will break your heart." How right she had been. Dr. Sterling returned an hour later to find Hank more composed but visibly aged by the stress of the revelation. "Your family is very upset, Mr. Thompson. They're questioning everything they thought they knew about you. Whatever happened all those years ago, don't you think they deserve to know the truth?" Hank turned his head toward the window, watching the autumn leaves fall from the oak tree in the hospital courtyard. Each leaf seemed to represent another year of carrying this burden, another year of looking his children in the eye while harboring such a significant secret. "Doctor," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "some truths are more dangerous than lies. What if telling them destroys more than it heals? With respect, sir, that's not your decision to make anymore. The bullet fragment has already destroyed the lie. Now you have to choose whether to let your family imagine the worst or trust them with the reality." As if summoned by their conversation, David appeared in the doorway, his face streaked with tears but his jaw set with determination. "Dad, I've been thinking about what you said in there, about nobody being supposed to get hurt. What did you mean by that?" Hank looked at his eldest son, seeing not the successful insurance adjuster, but the little boy who used to follow him around the farm, hanging on his every word. The child who had believed his father was a hero, who had grown up trying to live up to an impossible standard set by a man who was, himself, deeply flawed. "Son," Hank said, his voice cracking with emotion, "there are some things that happened before you were born, things that I thought I could carry to my grave. But maybe it's time you knew the truth about your grandfather and what really happened that day in 1975. The weight of 40 years of secrets hung in the air between them like a loaded gun, ready to discharge and change their family forever." In the hallway, Marty, Lisa, Michael, and Sarah waited with bated breath, knowing that whatever came next would either heal their family or tear it apart completely. The bullet fragment continued to rest in its sterile container, a small piece of metal that had carried the power to unravel decades of carefully maintained deception. And in that hospital room, as autumn shadows lengthened across the floor, Hank Thompson prepared to finally tell the truth about the day his father almost destroyed them both. Hank Thompson's voice emerged as a broken whisper, each word seeming to cost him physical pain as he began to unravel the story that had shaped his entire adult life. "It was November 15th, 1975. I was 23 years old, and your grandfather Earl had been struggling with demons that none of us understood back then. We didn't have words like PTSD or trauma counseling. We just called it the war nerves and expected men to drink their way through it." David pulled his chair closer to the hospital bed, his heart pounding as he sensed they were about to cross a threshold from which there could be no return. The rest of the family gradually filtered back into the room, drawn by the gravity in Hank's voice, each taking positions around the bed like mourners at a funeral. "Earl had served in Korea," Hank continued, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the hospital window. "Came home in 1953 with stories he never told and nightmares that woke the whole house. Your grandmother did her best, but she didn't understand why he'd started drinking so heavily, why he'd disappear for days at a time, why he couldn't hold down steady work anymore." Marty found herself holding her breath, her nursing experience having taught her to recognize the signs of deep psychological trauma, even in retrospect. "Hank, what happened on that hunting trip?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel as Hank's weathered hands gripped the hospital blanket. Earl had been talking about ending it all for weeks, not directly, mind you, but in that way men of his generation did, talking about how the family would be better off without him, how he was nothing but a burden, how he couldn't live with the things he'd seen and done in Korea. Lisa gasped, covering her mouth with her hand as the implications began to dawn on her. Grandpa he was going to kill himself, Hank finished quietly. That hunting trip wasn't about deer, son. It was about Earl Thompson finding a way to end his suffering while making it look like an accident so your grandmother could collect his life insurance policy. Back then, suicide voided all insurance claims, and he knew she'd need the money to survive. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the steady beeping of medical equipment and the distant sounds of hospital activity in the corridor. Michael was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. "But Dad, you said nobody was supposed to get hurt. What went wrong?" Hank closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 23 again, standing in the misty woods with his father's .22 rifle between them and the weight of an impossible choice bearing down on his young shoulders. "I figured out what he was planning. I'd seen him writing letters he never sent, putting his affairs in order, giving away his tools to neighbors. When he suggested we go hunting together, just the two of us, I knew it was his way of saying goodbye." "So you went with him to stop him," Sarah said softly, her nurse's intuition filling in the gaps of the story. "I tried to," Hank replied, his voice breaking. "We walked out to the old oak grove behind the Mitchell place, where Earl said the deer trails were most active. But instead of setting up to hunt, he sat down on a fallen log and told me his plan, said he was going to make it look like a hunting accident, that I was to tell everyone his rifle discharged accidentally while he was cleaning it." David felt tears streaming down his face as he began to understand the impossible burden his father had carried. "You tried to take the gun away from him." "I wrestled with him for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes," Hank continued. "Earl was strong, even weakened by drink and despair. The rifle went off during the struggle, and I felt the bullet tear through my back just below my left shoulder blade. The pain was incredible, but all I could think about was that Earl was still alive, still had the gun, still intended to finish what he'd started." Marty's medical training kicked in as she processed the story. "The bullet fragment lodged near your spine. You could have been paralyzed, could have died from blood loss or infection." "I didn't care about that," Hank said fiercely. "All I cared about was convincing Earl that he had something to live for. I told him that if he killed himself now, I'd bleed to death in those woods, and he'd be responsible for 2 deaths instead of 1. I told him that your grandmother needed him, that I needed him, that running away from the pain wasn't the answer." The revelation hit the family like successive shock waves, each detail reframing everything they thought they knew about their family history. Lisa found herself remembering Earl Thompson as the gentle grandfather who had taught her to whittle and told her stories about farm life, not as a broken veteran contemplating suicide. "Did it work?" Michael asked. "Did you save him?" Hank's expression grew even more pained as he approached the most difficult part of his story. "For that day, yes. Earl helped me stop the bleeding, drove me to a clinic 3 counties over where they could treat the wound without asking too many questions. We agreed to tell everyone I'd had an accident with farm equipment, that I'd need a few weeks to recover before returning to work." "But that wasn't the end of it," David said, sensing there was more to the story. "Earl made me promise never to tell anyone what really happened," Hank continued. "He said he couldn't live with the shame of people knowing he'd been weak enough to consider suicide, that he'd accidentally shot his own son in his moment of cowardice. He begged me to keep the secret, and I agreed because I thought it would help him heal." The tragedy of the situation was becoming clear to everyone in the room. Sarah spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "But keeping the secret didn't heal him, did it?" Hank's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs as he delivered the devastating conclusion to his story. "Earl never got over the guilt. He stopped drinking, started going to church, tried to be the man he thought he should be. But the weight of what had happened, the knowledge that he'd shot his own son, ate away at him every day. 3 months later, he drove his truck into that bridge abutment on Highway 30. The state police called it a single-car accident caused by bad weather, but I knew better. The room fell silent except for the sound of muffled crying as the family processed the full scope of the tragedy. Earl Thompson hadn't died in a random accident. He had successfully completed the suicide attempt that Hank had interrupted months earlier, but with the added burden of guilt over shooting his son. "You've been carrying this alone for 40 years, Marty said, her voice filled with wonder and heartbreak. "Protecting Earl's memory, protecting your family from the truth, living with both the physical pain of that bullet fragment and the emotional pain of losing your father to suicide." "And Mom knew," David said, not asking but stating a fact that had become obvious. "She had to have known. That's why she was always so protective of you, why she never questioned your reluctance to go to doctors, why she always defended your privacy when we kids wanted to hear war stories." Hank nodded slowly. "Helen figured it out within the first year of our marriage. She was too smart and too observant to be fooled by my story about farm equipment accidents. When I finally told her the truth, she made me promise 2 things: that I would never tell you children while Earl's memory could be tarnished in your eyes, and that I would eventually get proper medical treatment for the wound." "But you never did get treatment," Sarah observed. "You let that bullet fragment fester in your back for decades, creating chronic infection and pain, rather than risk having the truth discovered." "I couldn't take the chance," Hank replied. "X-rays would have shown the fragment and questions would have been asked. I thought I could carry the secret to my grave. Let Earl be remembered as the good man he tried to be in his final months, rather than the broken veteran who almost destroyed us both." Lisa was crying openly now, mourning not only for the grandfather she'd never truly known, but for the father who had sacrificed so much to preserve that memory. "Dad, you could have died from the infection. You almost did die." Was protecting Grandpa's reputation worth risking your life? The question hung in the air as Hank considered his answer. Looking around the room at his children and the people who had become like family, he saw the pain his secret had caused, but also the love that had survived its revelation. "I don't know if it was right or wrong," he said finally. "I only know that I was 23 years old, and I thought I was doing what a good son should do. Maybe if we'd had better understanding of mental health back then, if your grandfather had gotten the help he needed instead of trying to suffer in silence, none of this would have happened." The weeks following Hank's revelation unfolded like the slow healing of a decades-old wound. November arrived with its characteristic Iowa chill, and the Thompson farmhouse became a gathering place for a family learning to rebuild itself on a foundation of truth rather than protective lies. The bullet fragment, now preserved in a small glass case on the mantelpiece, served as a tangible reminder of the price of keeping secrets and the courage required to finally speak them aloud. David had taken extended leave from his insurance job, moving temporarily into his childhood bedroom to help his father recover from both the surgery and the emotional exhaustion of finally sharing his burden. The irony wasn't lost on him that he, who made his living assessing risks and calculating the cost of accidents, had been blind to the trauma that had shaped his own family for 4 decades. "I keep thinking about all the times I complained that you never talked about your feelings," David said one evening, as they sat together on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the cornfields gold. "Now I understand you were protecting us from pain we weren't equipped to handle as children." Hank pulled his jacket tighter against the autumn chill, his surgical incision still tender but healing well under Sarah's careful monitoring. "Maybe Helen was right all along. Maybe I should have trusted you kids with the truth when you were old enough to understand it. Secrets have a way of becoming heavier over time, and I let this one nearly crush me." The community response to the full story had been overwhelming in its compassion. When David shared the details with the local newspaper, with Hank's permission, the article that resulted sparked a broader conversation about veteran mental health and the lasting impacts of war trauma on entire families. The VFW Post established a support group for families dealing with military-related mental health issues, with Hank agreeing to serve as a founding member despite his natural reluctance to be in the spotlight. "Your grandfather wasn't weak," Hank told his grandchildren during one of their evening visits. "He was sick in a way that people didn't understand back then. The war hurt his mind the same way a bullet might hurt your body, and without proper treatment, that wound festered just like mine did." 12-year-old Tommy Mitchell, Sarah's son, had become a regular presence at the farmhouse, helping with chores and listening to Hank's stories with the fascination of a boy hungry for male guidance. "Mr. Thompson, do you think my dad would have been like your dad if he'd lived?" he asked one afternoon while they worked together mending fence posts. The question caught Hank off guard, reminding him that trauma and loss took many forms, and that his role in this extended family had grown beyond anything he had imagined. "Your father didn't have to carry the kind of wounds my dad did," he replied carefully. "But what matters most is that you understand that asking for help when you're hurting isn't weakness, it's courage." Sarah had indeed become more than a neighbor. She was family in every way that mattered. Her medical expertise had been invaluable during Hank's recovery, but more importantly, her presence had filled a void in the farmhouse that had existed since Helen's death. The relationship between her and Hank had evolved naturally, from friendship to something deeper, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of loss. "I never imagined I'd find love again at my age," Hank confided to Marty one afternoon as they worked together preparing Thanksgiving dinner. "But Sarah understands things about me that I never had to explain. She sees the scars, both visible and hidden, and doesn't turn away." Marty's own feelings had undergone a transformation as well. The revelation of Hank's long-carried secret had initially felt like a betrayal, but as she processed the full scope of his sacrifice, her hurt had evolved into something approaching awe. "Helen always said you were the strongest man she knew," Marty replied, her voice soft with emotion. "I think I finally understand what she meant." The relationship between Marty and Hank had settled into something comfortable and familiar, not the romantic love she had once imagined, but a deep friendship built on decades of shared history and mutual care. She had found peace in finally understanding that her role in his life, while different from what she had hoped, was no less valuable. Lisa and Michael had returned to their own families and jobs, but the weekly phone calls that had become sporadic after Helen's death were now regular occurrences. The shared knowledge of their grandfather's struggle and their father's sacrifice had created a new intimacy among the siblings, a recognition that they were part of a story larger than any of them had realized. "I've been thinking about Dad's courage," Lisa told her brothers during one of their conference calls, "not just in keeping Grandpa's secret, but in finally telling us the truth. It would have been easier to take that story to his grave, but he chose to trust us with it instead." Dr. Sterling had become more than just Hank's surgeon. He had become a friend and advocate, using Hank's case to illustrate the importance of mental health support for veterans and their families. The medical community's response to the case study he published had led to improved protocols for identifying and treating long-term complications from unaddressed trauma. "Your father's case has already helped other families," Dr. Sterling told David during a follow-up appointment. "We've identified 3 other patients with similar hidden injuries that might have gone undiagnosed for years. Sometimes the most important healing happens not just for the patient, but for everyone who learns from their story." The financial impact of the surgery and its aftermath had been entirely absorbed by the community fundraising efforts, with the surplus funds establishing a permanent fund at the hospital for veterans facing medical hardships. Hank's embarrassment at accepting help had gradually transformed into pride at being part of something that would benefit others facing similar challenges. As Thanksgiving approached, the Thompson farmhouse buzzed with preparations for what would be the largest family gathering in years. Sarah and Tommy would be joining the traditional celebration, along with Marty and several of Hank's veteran friends from the VFW. The holiday had taken on new meaning as a celebration not just of abundance, but of survival and the courage to face difficult truths. "This is what your mother always wanted," Hank told his children as they worked together preparing the farmhouse for the holiday guests. "A house full of family, real conversations instead of polite small talk, and the knowledge that we could weather any storm as long as we faced it together." The night before Thanksgiving, Hank sat alone in his study, looking through boxes of Earl's belongings that had remained packed away in the attic for decades. Among the items were letters Earl had written but never sent, to his commanding officers, to veterans organizations, to his family, expressing the pain and confusion that had ultimately overwhelmed him. "I wish I could have saved you," Hank whispered to his father's photograph, a young man in military uniform, with eyes that held no hint of the struggles to come. "But maybe sharing your story now will help save someone else." Sarah found him there an hour later, tears on his cheeks but his expression peaceful in a way she had never seen before. "Are you all right?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his desk. "I'm better than all right," he replied, reaching for her hand. "For the first time in 40 years, I'm free. The truth was supposed to break my heart, but instead it's given me my life back." The Thanksgiving meal the next day was a celebration of more than seasonal traditions. As Hank rose to offer the traditional blessing, he looked around the table at faces that represented not just his biological family, but the chosen family that had embraced him through his darkest revelation and helped him find his way back to the light. "This year I'm grateful for the courage to finally tell the truth," he began, his voice strong and clear. "I'm grateful for a family that loved me enough to hear it, and I'm grateful for the understanding that sometimes the heaviest burdens become the greatest blessings when we finally find the strength to share them." The bullet fragment continued to rest in its place of honor on the mantelpiece, no longer a source of shame but a symbol of survival, sacrifice, and the ultimate triumph of truth over the corrosive power of secrets. And in the warm glow of the dining room, surrounded by the people who mattered most, Hank Thompson finally understood what Helen had meant when she said that love strong enough to endure difficult truths was the only kind of love worth having. For 68 years, Harold Thompson carried a bullet fragment in his back and an even heavier burden in his heart, the secret of his father's struggle with what we now know as PTSD. Like so many of our generation, Hank believed that protecting his family meant shouldering pain alone, that strength meant silence, and that some truths were too dangerous to share. But when that corroded piece of metal was finally removed from his body, it freed more than just infected tissue. It liberated a family from decades of unspoken grief and misunderstood heroism. Hank's story reminds us that the secrets we carry to protect our loved ones often become the very barriers that prevent authentic connection. His grandfather Earl, like countless veterans of his era, suffered in silence because seeking help was seen as weakness. Yet when Hank finally found the courage to share his truth, his family didn't fall apart. They grew stronger, bound together by understanding rather than divided by mystery. Sometimes the wounds we hide become the very keys to healing, not just for ourselves, but for generations that follow. The greatest gift we can give our families isn't the illusion of perfection, but the courage to be beautifully, authentically human. What family secret or burden have you carried alone that might actually bring your loved ones closer if shared? Have you ever discovered that someone you admired was fighting battles you never knew about? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.